All right. So, our speaker today is Mr. Ken Meyer. And Liz, would you like to introduce him?
I'm so happy to introduce Ken. Ken Meyer he's obtained his BS degree in zoology from the University of Maine, Orono, in 1977, and he got his PhD also in zoology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, also my alma mater, in 1987. From then until 1996, he studied imperiled birds as a postdoctoral, and he was a research assistant in the University of Florida's Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation, and as a research biologist with the National Park Service. Um, since 1996, he has served as a courtesy associate professor in the University of Florida's Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation. So you guys might also have heard of the Avian Research and Conservation Institute. Ken is a co-founder of that. It's in Gainesville, Florida. He has held the positions of senior research ecologist and executive director, and has conducted over 44 years of avian field research and monitoring, producing management and conservation recommendations. They've studied the behavior and ecology of 21 species of birds of conservation concern in North, Central, and South America, and also the Caribbean Basin. In 2002 and again in 2014, he received a Partners in Flight National Research Award for studying the conservation biology of species at risk. And in 2005, a National Wildlife Stewardship Award from the Sustainable Forestry Initiative for cooperative studies of swallow-tailed kites. I encourage you to go on to the ARCI website. You can find them on Facebook. Also, you can go onto their website, but it is a not-for-profit organization, and any kind of donations, of course, are greatly appreciated. So without further ado, I'm so happy that Ken Meyer has agreed to make this presentation for us. Thank you so much, Ken.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks everybody for coming. And I'm glad you're out there as invisible as you are. So I'm going to talk as if you're just sitting right here in my living room. And I'm going to tell you about, give you an update, just a quick overview of our work on swallow-tailed kites, which began in 1988 during my postdoc. And we do still do quite a bit on swallowtail kites. They had a very small population since about the 1940s. And I want to first acknowledge my co-author here, Gina Kent. Alice, can you see my cursor moving? Maybe your
Yes, I
mic.
can see it.
Okay, good. So I'll use that if I need to point some things out. Yeah, Gina's worked with me for 25 years or so. And so much of what I'm going to talk about today has her involvement in it. I've lost track of the number of species that we've studied. Many of them we do telemetry work because it's a great tool for answering a lot of different questions for species at risk, imperiled species, threatened and endangered, such as snail kites and caracaras, which we also study. So I'm going to run through swallowtail kites first, and then I'll spend more time talking about our Kestrel project, which is now just finished its 4th year. We started planning for this Kestrel project 5 years ago, over 5 years ago. So we're good to have it underway. And as technology gets better, there are more things that we can learn about the Kestrel. But first, the swallowtail kite. This is why right here, this map shows the distribution. This is why I got very interested in studying them, because they used to occur in at least 21 states or so, probably more than that, all the way up the Mississippi drainage prior to 1940. And for whatever reason, the population took a large dive at that point, in 1940. It happened rather abruptly, and the kite was left to breed only in the 6 and sometimes 7 southeastern states, from South Carolina all the way over to Louisiana, a little bit into eastern Texas. I can't tell you exactly why that happened. Clear cutting of hardwood forest along lowlands probably was a factor. Egg collecting was a serious, very serious, quote, gentleman's hobby. And it was kind of cutthroat because these eggs, the eggs you see there, they typically lay 2 eggs up near the tops of the tallest trees in the stand. But a clutch, which was usually just 2 eggs, from a swallowtail kite nest would sell for $25 or more way back in the early 1900s, uncorrected for inflation. So that was a lot of money. And of course, there's even more than the money, there was a lot of that ego involved by these gentlemen. It probably did take a toll on swallow-tailed kites. The bird in the upper left is bringing nest material, Spanish moss. They also use other types of epiphytes like old man's beard, which you can see in the cup of that nest. This is a great picture by Deborah Jansen from the Big Cypress National Preserve. She took this from a helicopter with a telephoto lens. So they did not do any damage to get this picture. And the birds in the upper right, that's a courting pair, the male bringing food to the female, or he's just handed it to her. I'm not sure which. Max Stone helped us out. He's a wonderful photographer and a naturalist, and he got some great pictures of swallowtails that he gave to us to use in presentations like this. These young birds are about 3/4, 2/3 of the way to fledging. They fledge at about 40 days, a little bit less, and then they're on their own. But as you can see, this is a typical nest right up at the top of an old pine, and that enables them to build a rather feeble nest out of epiphytes and small twigs and have a lot of support from large limbs. By putting it up there, when the pines get older, as you probably have noticed, the top tends to flatten out and open up like this. You also can tell that the kites have a great view from up there. More than a view, though, what they're taking advantage of is the wind. Swallowtail kites can soar all day long. They have long, beautiful, pointy wings, narrow wings. Aerodynamically, that's called a high aspect ratio wing, and it's very efficient. It's not powerful for direct horizontal flight, but it's very, very efficient for soaring, rising up on thermals and other warm air from other sources, like a warm body of water. These 2 birds, they're getting a lot closer to fledging, still a couple of weeks or so to go, or at least 10 days. That brown coloration probably adds some camouflage. And I've told this story since 1988, so forgive me if you've heard it before, but I was very curious about, why would a bird develop this camouflage plumage and then have to molt those feathers? Because, of course, swallowtail kites have white heads. They don't molt them. Those are the feathers that bird is going to carry for the next 14 months. But they are brown when they first emerge from their sheaths. And that adds some camouflage. And then once they're out of the nest and they're flying around, the sunlight bleaches those feathers to stark white. The part I tell people is, as a graduate student, as a postdoc, as a professional biologist these days, we don't have money to spare. There was no way I could learn that any other way than taking some of the feathers that fell from the nest, putting some of them in my desk drawer and putting others on the dashboard of my old truck. And the ones on my truck dashboard turned white, and the ones in my desk drawer stayed brown. So there you go. Science at work. We did a lot of work on swallowtail kites on timberlands, commercial timberlands of all sorts, of all degrees of sustainability. What you see here, all this red or green coloration, it sounds like I'm colorblind, I'm not. All this coloration, the darkest green spots were nest locations between 1996 and 2011, over 1,000 nests that we found from the ground, sometimes from helicopters. These are locations where nests were, and also where the kites were foraging in the lighter green colors. So what this gives us is a map of where there is good breeding range for swallow-tailed kites. And it does go farther south in Florida, but that's not included on the map because we didn't do much tracking there. So much of this land that you see is timberland. So we started a partnership with American Bird Conservancy, E.J. Williams. I hope some of you know her. She's done great work and she's about to retire this year. We've worked on a lot of different projects. She was head of migratory birds at the Fish and Wildlife Service in the Southeast region for a number of years, and Turkey Federation, Longleaf Alliance, etc. She wasn't running from the law. She's just very enthusiastic, and if things started to slow down around her, she would move on and do great things elsewhere. She's been with ABC a long time. So Sustainable Forestry Initiative, Sustainable Forest Initiative got involved, lots of different companies, and they were very enthusiastic about using the swallowtail kite as a flagship for the conservation of forest birds. And we wound up surveying forest birds, not just swallowtail kites, and found that forest practices which mimic natural ecological succession, everything from dirt up to mature trees, it actually mimics what disturbance such as fire and hurricanes, etc. It mimics those factors, and on a large managed forest landscape, we have lots of different stages of ecological succession. So we have a lot of diverse prey species in size, taxonomically, in all kinds of things. And swallowtail kites eat lots and lots of insects. I'm going to come back to that point at the end, or if I've told you about kestrels, so I'll just leave it at that. But when the swallowtails, I will say, when the swallowtails are getting ready to migrate, they're gorging on insects right after they've spent all their time catching small vertebrates to feed their young, anoles, tree frogs, tree snakes. So interesting that this highly omnivorous birds relies most of the year on insects. There's one now. I didn't plan that. So at the end of the nesting season, they are getting ready to migrate long distances. So they want to put on a lot of fat. And this bird is catching a bug. It may be a stink bug. They catch a lot of insects over fields, melon fields, for instance. You've probably heard of this around Gainesville in July, late June, July. It's possible to see hundreds of swallowtail kites at a time over fields out to the west of Gainesville, out toward the Swanee River. I'm just touching on a whole bunch of things. I could talk about swallowtails all night, but I'm not going to. So what happens at the end of the nesting season, though, a beautiful phenomenon that also has enormous practical management and conservation value. Swallowtail kites gather in large pre-migration communal roosts. Then they go out and feed together during the day. They use each other to find ephemeral swarms of insects. So we're talking about June and July. They have fledged their young, and the young are involved with them as well, but the parents are trying to stay away from their young. Otherwise, they just beg. So the young birds that come into these communal roosts, they beg to any adult, and they don't get fed. So they learn pretty soon not to bother. This is a Max Stone picture, as noted there. This is from an airplane. This is how we count swallowtail kites in these roosts. This is an incredible opportunity to track this population, counting swallowtail kites while they're gathering to put on fat to migrate 5,000 miles at least to central and southern Brazil and some other countries in South America. This is what it looks like when they jump off the southwest peninsula of Florida. Those green dots are lots of different individuals over the years. They don't land on Cuba for the most part. They just keep going, and then they pile up over there on the eastern shore of the Yucatan Peninsula. Gina Kent did her master's work on this phenomenon, this stopover on the Yucatan. It's the only place in the 5,000 mile southbound migration, or northbound migration for that matter, of swallowtail kites where they stop over, where they have to rest, eat food, put weight back on, etc. So this is what the southbound migration of swallowtails looks like. Each color line is a different individual bird. Our wonderful colleague Jennifer Colson tagged a few swallowtails, has and continues to, over in Louisiana. And I don't know how, it's been almost the whole time I've been studying kites that Jennifer has as well. And so we've become great friends and great colleagues. But as you can see, the birds she tagged over there, the green lines, they just went straight across the Gulf. They didn't come through Florida. Birds east of that those green lines of Jennifer's actually do come over into Florida. You don't see them on here because this is only 20 swallowtail kites represented. So this is the southbound migration. You can see how far it is, goes across the equator. They leave here in the late summer, and then that means that they are arriving in the austral winter. And they spend their time on cattle ranches in Brazil. Lots of their time. Lots of birds spend lots of their time. Big termite infestations in these fields, lots of big termite mounds, 3, 4, 5 feet tall. So the swallowtails from here go down there, and guess what? There is a southern subspecies of swallowtail kites, and they nest in these areas. So our quote unquote swallowtail kites commingle with them during the winter. I had a technician who did an awesome job figuring this stuff out. As you can see here, these farms, these ranches are being converted to crop agriculture, soybeans, sugarcane, and in other places to eucalyptus trees for pulpwood for the paper industry. So Audrey Washburn went down every Florida summer for 9 years. I went down occasionally and learned a great deal. Remind me sometime to tell you the story about Audrey, because the fact that her mom is from Brazil and Audrey can speak Portuguese really didn't matter much to me when we were putting the first satellite transmitters on swallowtail kites back in 1996. I hired Audrey and a fellow named John Arnett to go down to South America and look for birds that they had helped put transmitters on in Florida. And their first afternoon out of the airplane in Brazil, they went out and located radio signals, old-fashioned radio signals from juveniles that they had helped me tag back in Florida a couple of months before. Lots more stories, just teasers there. So you invite me over to dinner sometime and I can tell you more. So this is what the migration northbound looks like. Same 20 birds that we had going south earlier in the picture. And you can see they don't go toward the tip of Peninsula Florida. They go up into the Gulf and they hope that they hit land. If they run into bad winds, they do not make landfall very quickly. Orange is northbound, green is southbound. So you can see this is the only place where this 5,000-mile migration corridor of swallowtail kites where it differs. It's when they get back. So they go to the northeast tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. They get down there in maybe late January, early February, and they wait. And they wait until they have strong enough tailwinds to make them think they are going to get blown northward across the Gulf of Mexico. The fact is, this is a very, very volatile area. Sometimes they hit headwinds quite frequently, and they wind up for days over the Gulf of Mexico. But what we learned by satellite tracking was they can only last 4 days and nights. After that, they run out of water. They probably run out of fat because they can't metabolize it without water. They may go into kidney failure, but they wind up in the Gulf of Mexico. Not unusual. So migration certainly takes its tolls. This is the ending of the swallowtail kite chapter here. And then I'll move on to kestrels. But I just love this slide. This is 5 different birds represented by the colors here. And you can see they have slightly varying routes northbound. This was in 2014. I won't tell you why the weather is so volatile in the Gulf of Mexico and Western Caribbean, but it is. Cold fronts move through in quick succession over the water. And as one cold front gives way to one following it, another one, the wind direction changes 180 degrees. If you know how high pressure systems circulate clockwise and outward from the center, that would make sense to you. It's dangerous for birds coming north across the Gulf because it's sort of a sucker punch. They leave the Yucatan on southerly winds, tailwinds. But when they get out here If another high pressure center is moved down, they're going to be in headwinds, strong headwinds. That's why some of them don't make it. But these 5 birds all made it. And what I love about this picture is where each of these lines ends is where each of these 5 birds nested the year before. And what they're going to do when they get there is they're going to find their nesting area. They're probably going to check out their old nests, but they're also going to find, if he or she survived, they're going to find their mate from the previous year because they have the same behavior, males and females. They go back to where they nested before. So if there's going to be any kind of pair bonding, any kind of fidelity, mate fidelity, it happens because of those places at the ends of those lines. And what are we doing to those places? I don't have to show you a picture for you to know. What do the villages look like, for instance? What is Florida looking like? You can fly from week to week and see differences on how developed, how rapidly Peninsular Florida is being developed. Yet, they go back to these nest places and find their mates from the previous year, and therefore are much more likely to be successful this year because that experience seems to matter. I don't know that for sure, but it's suggested from our data. So sometimes when people give us donations, they want to buy a transmitter or something, they ask us if we can name the kite after their mate or their grandchild or their dog or something. And we don't name kites after other beings. We name them after the places where we tag them. We honor those places. We understand how important place is and how threatened that whole concept is in a place like Florida. The last slide, this was a few years ago, but these are online. They should still be there. These are quite long, and they tell the story of swallowtail kites in pictures and narration. One was done by a great publication called Biographic, and the other was on the online version of National Audubon's Maine magazine. So if you take a picture of this or you ask me, I can give you the information, but all kinds of beautiful graphics. But for now, we're going to look at some graphics of this bird. I have come to love kestrels. I had always wanted to study them in Florida. I got out of grad school in 1987 and started ARCI in 1997 and have done a lot of raptors and other birds, but it was only 5 years ago that I decided I really wanted to try to study kestrels because I learned that they have been declining for the last 70 years, according to the records. And some people claim that they have declined almost as much as 90%. Actually, the quote is 92%. Even if it's half that, that's a very serious concern. And I always thought that other people were doing things to try to turn that around. We never worked on kestrels until we started tagging them in 2021, but I actually started in 2019 trying to find partners and raising money to buy tracking technology, which was primitive in 2021, only VHF radios. I'll tell you more about the tracking in a minute, but I just want to run through a little bit of the natural history. And for this talk, I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, Marcy Clutter, who was a president of Hernando Audubon for a short spell, but had a history of trying to help kestrels, even though the chapter wasn't doing a lot of work. But Marcy was doing that, and she was also very well versed in the ins and outs of native plant culture and the fundamental importance of native plants to everything we see around us, every living thing. And the reason I'm telling you about swallowtail kites and kestrels in the same talk is because Marcy and I are going to get married in a few days. And on the way to that, to that marriage, I've learned a lot about native plants that I didn't know about before. And it made me realize this is a very strong connection. Even though kestrels and swallowtail kites have extremely different behavior and morphology and ecology, they have that in common. They eat so many insects, each of those species, for the largest part of the year. And when they are eating small vertebrates, both of those species are eating things that thrive on insects. Just something to think about, I believe. I want to also point out at the bottom here, Mary and James Dowdell were in Hernando Audubon. Mary worked for FWC for years, and they passed away young at different times, close to each other in time. And the last conversation I had with Mary, she told me they were going to be bequeathing a wonderful gift to us, the ARCI. And I asked her what she'd like us to do with that. And she said, save kestrels because they're headed in the wrong direction. There's not enough being done. Those were her words. I left out a couple of more colorful words that Mary was that way. Mary was the main assistant to Roger Torrey Peterson for years. She grew up in Maine and worked with him for many, many years. And her husband, James, they were so generous to us. And also I'd like to thank and cite Robert Simons, Bob Simons of Alachua Audubon. He started studying kestrels in Alachua County 32 years ago. And he did an amazing job of getting nest boxes out. I hope I'm getting that right. There's a 52-year celebration for Bob as well. And one was how long he was on the board of Alachua Audubon, and the other was how long he studied kestrels. He didn't study them so much as tried to grow them. He was a kestrel farmer with nest boxes and raised a lot of screech owls in the process. He's the reason I finally got started studying kestrels recently. Okay, so I told you, Southeastern American Kestrel is a different subspecies, Paulus, and we abbreviated SEAK because you'll see that throughout here a little bit. They're non-migratory. They live and breed they live year-round in Florida. They breed in a normal breeding season. They aren't close to the nest all year, but they may or may not go really far. We don't know. They're listed as threatened in Florida. That is the highest designation. There is no endangered status in Florida. There's something like 30 or so birds in Florida that are given this highest, most serious classification as threatened. And it's 82. I'm sorry, I said 92%. In the last 70 years, 82% decline. So what's causing the kestrel's decline and how do we reverse it? There are a lot of wonderful, smart people who have studied the American kestrel over the continent for many years, and they are as befuddled as everybody else as to what the main cause is. It might be a set of challenges, but one of my favorite biologists in any respect, John Smallwood, he was at UF the same time I was there, and I just saw him last week at the Raptor meeting. He studied kestrels his whole career. He's now studying them in New Jersey. He teaches at Montclair College. And he had a great quote in an Audubon magazine that addressed the decline of the American kestrel. And he said, I just have one word for you about the causes: grasshoppers. And what he was saying was that the changes in agriculture, shorter grasses, mowing, too much grazing, too much herbicide, too much pesticide applied to hay, because hay is a commercial crop. Things like this. They're reducing, they might be a problem in themselves, the pesticides especially, but they reduce the populations of things like grasshoppers. You can open some kestrel nest boxes and find piles, a big pile of almost uncountable legs of grasshoppers. They mustn't go down very well because the kestrels don't eat them. So these are prey that the adults have brought back to their young. So there's various things we could have done and undoubtedly have done that have decreased the numbers of insects. So there it is: insects, lizards, small rodents. Those larger things, those are relatively infrequent. But when the adult kestrels are feeding their young, those big things like a mouse or a lizard could be very important. One thing that might be helping kestrels in Florida these days is the proliferation of Cuban anoles. right into the range of the Florida green anole and perhaps even displacing it. Cuban anoles get larger and they're very hardy. And in urban settings, we have a few nests in urban settings, and it's hard to believe, but one of those nests is famous for having double clutched, double brooded every year for the last 4 years. And it produced a successful first brood, then a second brood, three of the four were also successful. And the parents are still feeding young from the first brood, young that are out on the wing and could fly to California if they wanted to. And they're still mooching off their parents while their parents are feeding the second brood that's either still in the box or going to be nearby outside the box very soon. So lots of stories within the stories there. Sorry. We do this with buttons instead. Okay, so insects. That top picture, that's just beautiful kestrel habitat. Imagine open pine forest, something that looks like this, that burns frequently enough to keep down ground cover and understory growth. Longleaf pine with wiregrass underneath, not too dense on the ground, burning every 1 to 3 years. That is just great kestrel habitat. But the kestrel has learned, as we lost those historic massive longleaf forests years ago, and as we lost the large fires that would happen from lightning strikes or from indigenous people who would light these fires so they could move across the landscape easier and hunting at certain times of year. Those fires are what maintain the forest in this appearance, this top picture. And kestrels thrive there if they had some help from one of their friends. I'll tell you that in the next slide or so. But now kestrels are using pasture, closely cropped grass, lots of cow manure, lots of insects feeding out there on all kinds of things. They also occur in more open, dry prairies and different farm settings, sometimes golf courses, et cetera, et cetera. So they're very adaptable. We don't know if they do equally well in all these settings. To be conservative, we would probably want to think that they do best in habitats that best mimic their historic habitat. Fire, essential. So habitats in Florida or anywhere else that rely on fire to maintain their ecological integrity, to keep this pine forest a pine forest. They're called pyrogenic. They're generated by frequent fire. And that makes all the difference in the world for kestrels, because if the grass gets too tall on rich soil, within a few weeks, the grass may become too tall under a pine in an open pine forest for the kestrels to find food, either to see it or to be able to capture it. So this is their friend, the red-cockaded woodpecker. This is why kestrels nested in those historic open pine forests, and it is why they are still nesting where we have either preserved or, in more cases, restored open pine forests and are restoring longleaf forest. So red-cockaded woodpeckers build their own cavities. You can see the tool there attached to the bird's head. And of course, they have these resin flows that protect them from predation by snakes. They nest in old pine trees, usually at least 60 years old, because old pine trees are subject to something called red heart disease. It's a fungus that softens up the heartwood. It makes it kind of spongy. And so once the woodpecker gets through the sapwood, which is a big job, they get into this nirvana of red-cockaded woodpecker breeding sites. They have a large enough cavity that they can raise young and protect their young. So every now and then they'll abandon a cavity. They'll have spare cavities, sometimes from mortality or whatever. These cavities are no longer being used by the woodpeckers. And so larger woodpeckers then start to open up the opening. So these are two cavities that started out as red-cockaded, but the upper one you can see is already being enlarged. Maybe that's a flicker doing that or a red-bellied woodpecker, but they make them larger. Still too small, though, for an American kestrel. However, a pileated woodpecker will then come along and open it up even more. The catch is the pileateds tend to make the cavities sometimes, often more elongated, as you can see here. Now, this is a kestrel nesting cavity, and you can see it used to be a red-cockaded woodpecker cavity. That lighter area right around the cavity entrance it's called the plate. It's actually very, very hard. It's dyed. It's the inner layer of the sapwood or the outer layer of the heartwood. I'm not sure which. But some of these cavities actually get much larger and elongated, kind of rectangular by the pileateds. Yet that's a resource for the kestrels, even though the openings are bigger than they need. And what that means is predators can get in there. So people realized decades ago that kestrels will use nest boxes. And this is probably the main reason we still have the Southeastern American kestrel and kestrels in a lot of other places in North America. As you can see, those natural cavities, they just get to the point where they're open on top or they're so big that either predators can get in easily or rainwater gets in. And people who have studied kestrels for a while have seen examples of where nestling kestrels will drown because their cavity floods. Nest boxes are a gift to kestrels and to us, people who want to conserve them, people who want to manage for them. They work very, very well. It's good to clean them out. It's good to use the right dimensions, the right materials, good to build them out of cedar instead of pine. These boxes here, this one on the right should have ventilation holes or some space up here below the top. It does not. This one's a little bit better. You can see a gap there. But they also work best if they're cleaned out at the end of each year. And if at the point when they are cleaned out, people replace the wood shavings and in the bottom, and that tends to make them a little more attractive and probably subjected to fewer ectoparasites. We don't know all of this for sure, but it works, and that's all we need to know. It helps us grow kestrels. So I know there's a lot, but this is real important. This is my dream. This is what I want to do for Southeastern American kestrels in Florida. I want to learn these things because they haven't been learned before, even though this bird has been listed by the state for many years. There's an angle to this, though, and I don't want to read all these to you. I'll let you just glimpse at them. But the idea here is to build a community, to engage landowners and land managers, whether they're private or public, agency people or farmers or people who just love open grassland. I want them to know the story of the Southeastern American kestrel and the plight of this bird. We also want to compare nesting success and productivity across habitats. As I mentioned, the kestrel's using a diversity of habitats just in Florida, or I'm familiar with them. But we don't know whether or not they are just as productive in an overgrazed cattle pasture where the grass is very short and they can forage easily there, the kestrels that is. We don't know if productivity is higher there than it is in native forest after a fire, et cetera, et cetera. So you can draw all kinds of comparisons because different kinds of open savanna, grasslands of various types, human created and maintained or natural. Kestrels can do well there if they have enough food and if they have a cavity to nest in. So we're very lucky that when we find a place where they do well at finding food and avoiding predation, if we put boxes out there, that can be very useful. For instance, in state forests and national forests, that are now being burned frequently to maintain them in an open pine situation. The kestrels would forage in those forests, in that open grass understory, but they wouldn't be able to use abandoned red-cockaded woodpecker cavities because the trees are too young. Even 50 and 60-year-old trees are too young. That's the ideal place to start a nest box program, especially if that is a large patch of forest. Don't ask me how large, I can't quote that, but where they can nest in that forest in their native setting, but then go out and forage in grazed pastures or grasslands of other kind that rely on fire or wet and dry seasons. In the right setting on the landscape, that correct combination of features, boxes can do wonders if we make that connection ourselves and don't just randomly hang them out on telephone poles along a 2-lane road where they're not going to be able to have their other needs met. So that's what I want to do. I want to get people excited about helping kestrels, teach them where the kestrels want to be so that they can do things to help them. And how are we going to know where the kestrels want to be? Well, that's by tracking them. And until just the last couple of years, and it's still in the very much in the infant stage, tracking technology, things we've used for years to track larger birds, only became small enough to go on kestrels in the last few years. And unfortunately, it hasn't been refined. The companies making this equipment, they're eager to get it out there because it's light enough to go on birds the size of kestrels. There's a market for that. Unfortunately, they don't do all their due diligence in terms of development and testing. And we wind up buying these things and then being the test pilots unknowingly when we paid for them to see how well these things work on birds. So we have high failure rates, but we are gradually learning which ones are better than others. And that was this year, this 2024 was the most productive year for me in using tracking to address questions that will enable us to do the things on this page. When I say community, I'm really serious about this idea of saying, okay, Watermelon Pond, Alachua County Environmental Protection, wonderful, wonderful place, great place for kestrel. Bob Simons put boxes out there years ago, and the kestrels are still using those same sites. It's been a few generations of boxes maybe. So a place like Watermelon Pond, for instance, a really, really good place to produce kestrels. But where do they want to go? So here's something very important. Kestrels, like most birds, disperse from their breeding, from their natal area where they were born when they're ready to breed on their own. This may be a way for species to avoid inbreeding, not staying too close to where you were born. So these long distance tracking methods that we're using will tell us how far the kestrels will go before they settle out to nest. There is something in the literature. John Smallwood collected a whole bunch of data. Carl Miller from Florida Fish and Wildlife wrote a paper on it back, I think, in maybe 2019. And they concluded from color bands and from colored wing tags, not transmitters, they concluded that the dispersal distance was on the order of about 5 miles on average, with the occasional bird going farther or shorter. 5 miles from their natal area. I'll show you the results from our tracking study for the last few years. It's 4 years of data, but with increasingly better technology. So the data from 2024 is by far the most reliable. It's more than 5 miles. So that's a very important piece of information if you're a land manager, if you're somebody passionate about managing the land you are responsible for to be productive for kestrels. So the kestrels that we tag on Watermelon Pond or on the Withlacoochee State Forest, and I'm going to tell you who all these agents, these organizations and people are. There's going to be a slide up there so you can say thanks to all of them subliminally or something. The places where these birds are being produced are not the places where those young birds are going to nest. However, young birds that were produced some distance away are going to move into that good habitat. Withlacoochee State Forest, Watermelon Pond, Etnaya Creek State Forest, places we're working. They will come in. So it's Uh, the young on the adults on any one of these places may produce too young, and too young may eventually settle just down the road from them and breed, but it's not their too young. It's birds that are more distantly related. So I'll show you the numbers in a minute about how far we think they are already, we already think they are moving. I'm going to just see if there's something I should say about anything on this list. No, people love this bird though. That's the whole idea. And if there's any single thing I've learned in my career that I share with in a polite way, in a respectful way, it is this. I have studied imperiled birds my whole career. Most of them are not listed. Snail kites and caracaras are the only listed species. Dabbled a little bit in peregrine falcons and bald eagles and such, but for the most part, it's non-listed species. So there's not a lot of resources to study these birds or to go out and do habitat management to make them more productive. That's a problem. That's something that my organization, ARCI, that's always been our mission: collect data that will support restoration, recovery, management, and conservation. But there's not, and this is not a plea for donations, although the door is always open. But that makes it tough to study these species. But it also has made it enormously gratifying for me. Okay, they're the organizations we're working with just now in this first year that we've made this big push. We are hoping next year to add a very substantial national forest, or a national forest, they're all substantial, a national forest that has a substantial number of kestrels on it in the Peninsular Florida. We also are interested in adding a commercial timber operation that has a large set aside within their acreages, their ownership, that is managed for quail. And they are proud of how many kestrels they have because they're burning that pine forest frequently. And it's not being harvested except on a sustainable basis very infrequently. So we're hoping we can connect up with them last year. But for now, enormous thanks and for all this opportunity to work with and have so much fun with Santa Fe Audubon, Alachua Audubon, Alachua County Environmental Protection, with Wacoochee State Forest, a hay farm. They raise awesomely good hay, I am told. I don't eat it myself. Shea Farm, it's around Jonesville. Hernando County School District, that's where we've got a nest box that Marcy started monitoring these birds years ago. So we put up a nest box. And this is where this is where the box has a second brood now every year for the last 4 years. We don't know if it's the same pair or not. But think about what, you don't have to be a scientist to realize what the cool question is there. Here is a school in just outside of Brooksville, gated communities completely around. You can't see much green at all. But there's a power line corridor, the sort of thing kestrels like to hunt in. And these neighborhoods, probably these gated communities, so we haven't gone to look, but they're probably loaded with Cuban anoles. That's what we see the kestrel parents bringing mostly to their young. And they're producing 2 broods. I mean, that's like getting to vote twice. Or, that's like, you get it. That's 2 broods every year. When the second brood was successful 3 out of 4 years, and they're still feeding young from both broods at the same time, there's a lot of food there. Boxes, boxes, boxes. Wouldn't that be awesome? So there you go. Those are the organizations. But now here are the people that I have the great fortune to work directly with. Bill Chitty over in Nettenina Creek State Forest with Santa Fe Audubon. Eric Amundsen, Debbie Siegel from Alachua Audubon. Debbie's president. Eric's head of the Kestrel program. Miguel Olvera, I met him through Bob Simons and Eric a few years ago, and that is why I am working with these people now. And it's just one of the greatest joys of my professional life. Jose Miguel Ponciano is a faculty member at UF who's on the board of Audubon, and he's contributed lots of mental resources and energy to all of this just in his spare time. Andy Christman runs Alachua County's Environmental Protection Department. She supervises Michael Nelson and Milo Nealons. And then They have burrowing owls. They have the northernmost burrowing owl population out on Watermelon Pond. You folks all know this, I'm sure. Vince Morris, John Hoke, and Emily Saylor, they are the crew. Vince is senior, maximum, most highly respected forest ecologist. John is directly under him and is already almost there himself. He's amazing. Emily, these guys had the good fortune and the brains to hire Emily. This is, we're making enormous progress out on Withlacoochee Forest, the only place in our study areas in these partner organizations where we have natural cavities to compare productivity with boxes in the same stands, literally, sometimes next to each other. So what we're doing now is peppering that forest, including trees that are too young for RCWs to be nesting in, with high quality nest boxes. And then at the bottom, special thanks to the Wagmore Fund. This is for funding. The Wagmore Foundation, Alachua Audubon, Santa Fe Audubon, and two of my in-laws, Carolyn and Stephen Weiler. Okay. This is what good kestrel habitat looks like in Withlacoochee. Emily's up in the tree. John's looking at his phone. He does at least half the climbing. They carry these boxes up there, like slung around their shoulder, and these Swedish ladders, you put up 10-foot sections upward as you go. This is not easy work. I carry equipment in and then watch and make sure nobody needs to call an ambulance. These boxes actually go up pretty fast, and these folks are just so good at it and so fun to work. John is singing an aria here. No, not really, but that belt alone weighs about 30 pounds, and then he's got a box hanging on it, and then he takes the next sections of ladder up with him, sticks his arm through a hole, and it carries up 1 or 2 sections. And in 10 minutes he's back down again, and we go to the next tree. So I'm going to just show you a couple of collages here because this just illustrates things I've been telling you about. We are banding with aluminum bands, and we are color banding with unique codes every bird we handle. This year we did 64 juvenile kestrels in those study areas I just described, and 64 that are now color banded. And we're going to give you that information so you can spend your spare time looking for these birds anywhere in Florida. We just don't know where they're going to go. We're using a peeper or somebody on a ladder taking a picture. The only peeper shot is, no, none of these are peeper shots. Okay, never mind. So you can see birds in different stages of being handled. The bottom right, that's Miguel Olvera, Eric Amundsen in the back left, and Ernesto Reyes from Cuba, who helped us out this year as well in the field. So Miguel is awesome. I owe him an extra special thanks because Bob Simons hired Miguel to help him clean boxes and get them ready for the next year. And the last season that Bob was able to work, he invited me out. And so I met these people and at Watermelon Pond. And now we're hoping that Miguel will find his way into graduate school studying kestrels. And we don't do this work to support graduate work. This is not academic research. This is all about applied biology. But this is the one person I really want to see get a degree out of this because he sure deserves it. He's learned so much and he's so passionate about it. This is Emily Saylor down here from Withlacoochee. And you know what everything else is. Here's a brood of 4 or 5. Let's see what's next. Oh, yeah. Just love them. They're just so much. They're so inspiring because they're so small and they are so tough. And they bite really hard, too. So you learn that right away. But you know what? Anybody who learns, or for some people, it's the very first time I have them holding a bird for me. They know to be quiet, to be still, to keep the bird upright. They know just what to do. We don't even put a hood on these birds in that situation. If there's too many people talking, too many people hanging out, if we're moving the bird too much, they get cranky and they just start to bite really bad. And it makes it very hard to get the transmitter fitted exactly as you want to fit it, because you want it to stay on and you want the bird to be safe and not be impaired in any way. There's in this picture, there's 3 different kinds of transmitters. We were testing them this year. They were everything, different makers, everything from absolutely terrible to outstanding. I'm sorry, was somebody going to ask something? Okay. So this is a male. Obviously, he's got a VHF transmitter on him, and they run on batteries and they don't put out GPS fixes. But these other devices, especially, this is our favorite up here. This is a solar powered device that communicates with the cell phone system anywhere in the world and collects with a separate circuit, collects GPS fixes. So this is the state of the art. Many manufacturers are trying to achieve this. Collects GPS fixes up to about 3 a day, recharges with the solar cell there, and then every 24 hours uploads it to the cell phone system. It calls home, basically. And if we want to change that cycle or give that radio a message for some reason, we can do that. And the next time it turns on, 24 hours later, it'll pick up that message and change its cycle. This is what the tracking maps look like. And, you know, I'm not going to take the time to explain what we learned from each of these, but in some cases here, this lower left map, this is from Flagler Beach all the way over to Camp Landing. What is that? Something like 70 miles, I think, at least. These are these maps with yellow lines are made by transmitters that have GPS receivers in them. These 2, the center one and this green one over here, the bottom map was also GPS. These other 2 collect data in a different way. They don't have a GPS receiver on board, but they triangulate on cell towers. They hit different cell towers, and then the cell system and the radio in concert basically estimate a position based on triangulating the bearings and estimated differences to the towers. We used those until this year when we're ready to try the GPS ones and hope that one of them worked well. I can't tell you how, you can't tell from looking at this, but this is incredible information. And these are all birds that are just a few weeks out of the nest box. So here's a punchline I alluded to earlier. These are tentative examples of post-fledging movement. So this is within the first 2 to 8 weeks after they fledged this past summer, from a subset of 31 that we tagged, and out of 64 that we handled, and all got color banded and aluminum banded, but half of them almost contributed tracking data. The greatest distance traveled from the nest by any of the birds we tagged, and I calculated this about 3 or 4 weeks ago, it could be farther by now, is 53 miles. The average distance traveled from the nest was 19 miles. This is just as of sometime in late September, mid to late September. The average home range, so this is an area now. This is an entire area that a bird uses. It's called its home range. 121 square miles. That's the average. The maximum to this period was 240 square miles. The average longest dimension of the home range was 15 miles. And the average number of apparent core areas. So just looking at the data, eyeballing the data and saying, okay, look at this bird here. Here's a core area for sure. We've got a concentration of points. This might be an emerging wannabe core area. Here you can see a core area on this older style. This bird right here is the single bird we have data from so far, and it wasn't with the GPS. This one triangulated, and it lasted long enough that we learned that she bred. We tagged her in 2023, and she all indications are she nested all summer of 2024 up here, and that's 23 miles from where she was hatched. So remember I mentioned earlier that using the best available data, and John Smallwood's data was undoubtedly the best, but not using tracking devices. Biologists came up with an estimate that an average of 5 miles prenatal dispersal, meaning from where they were born to where they will breed for the first time. So 5 miles is the figure that people have been quoting for a long time, thinking that's what we have to work with in terms of management. If we have a kestrel nest box or a natural cavity here, they're going to settle in somewhere within 5 miles of here. So that's where we want to be looking at effecting suitable habitat management, a 5-mile radius. We'll get back to you when we've got more data from GPS after the next few months. So we're not going to know until early spring. And of course, a lot of the birds that have transmitters, they've either died, broken their antennas, or in a few cases, even the best transmitters fail. So we're already excited that this is going to be some important information about how far these birds are going to go and where we should be looking, where we should be smart and thinking about where to encourage and finance nest box communities within communities that love kestrels. Now, this might be one of them, but I'm guessing this is a net loss when it comes to habitat. This is an aerial shot of the villages.
Mm.
And I can tell you, I heard there were 9 more developments at the start of 2024 that will be larger than the villages that had already been site approved. A lot of them have been site prepped and already are building. We fly a lot for other species, fixed wing, small airplanes, and it's just horrible to look at north central and central Florida and what it's becoming. This is becoming the norm. Okay, going to wrap this up and just remind you, native plants, native plants, native plants. Native oaks support more than 550 different species of butterflies and moths. We did count that. Some insect nerd did that, and bless their heart. Chickadees feed their nestlings up to 9,000 caterpillars between hatching and fledging. Most landscaping plants sold in nurseries, exotics, they don't, non-native, they don't support these species. People have looked at crepe myrtles, for instance, not found a single living insect on crepe myrtles. But there it is. It's even here in print. These are all native plants, and these are native insects in Marcy's yard. This is less than a year after she bought a house and started planting native plants. She's a farm girl, but she plants grows. And it was really good soil, exceptionally good soil. She didn't know that. But the insects she's attracted are things that she's never seen, and she's spent most of her time doing this sort of thing. I'll tell you this, and you may not believe it, but I swear it's true. There was a swallowtail kite nest about 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile from her house where these plants were growing. And the first year she didn't have any plants in. And I would see the swallowtail kite pass between foraging areas no closer than 1/4 of a mile away. And it never came over her little quarter lot suburban neighborhood. This is in Inverness. After her garden was producing enough blossoms to attract these insects. So this was in 2024. We started seeing a swallow-tailed kite come over her yard and circle and start diving to catch insects coming up out of her 1/4 acre of suburbia. You too can have swallowtail kites nesting in your yard. It really is incredible. Where are these insects? Where were they before people planted native plants? How did they get the memo, you know? Well, visually and by scent, I assume all those ways, but it happened so fast. It's just so incredible. And if everybody had a 4 by 8 foot plot of appropriately sited native plants, your little universe would be richer for it. I don't know if any of you know Steve Turnipseed. He lives in the villages and he's a big proponent of native planting. This is his house when he bought it, upper left, and a different view of it around the corner, but this is what it looked like recently. It's actually a lot more going on there now. These are all native plants. He does water, he may fertilize, but he wouldn't have to. They would grow there. So here we are. There you are. Lots of messages. Hope you remember some of them. Hope you've enjoyed this. And I hope I see you out there watching birds somewhere. Glad to answer any questions if you'd like. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken, so very much. So my takeaway from this is that plant some native plants, keep an eye on the kestrels, and there are things that we can actually do to promote our birds and our wildlife. And
Absolutely.
And congratulations on your upcoming nuptials, by the way.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? You can put them right in there in the chat if you would like. And we do actually have a field trip going to native plant nursery that's opened here recently in Bellevue. So hopefully we'll get our own little swallowtail kite and kestrel habitats so that they can come to our yards too. That'd be awesome.
That's excellent. Great. Good for you. Good for them.
Yeah, yeah. Anybody have any questions? Otherwise, I will. Oh, thanks, Paula. Yeah, the GPS maps were awesome. I encourage anybody to go onto the ARCI Facebook page and website. It's super fun to track. The swallowtail kites are my favorite to follow. You can actually see when they're migrating. It's a really, really great resource. But we are so lucky to have Ken and ARCI here to protect our native wildlife, and the kestrels are so amazing. I think we're a little spoiled because we see so many that we really don't realize how threatened they actually are. So anyway, yeah. I'm not sure if Alex is still, are you here, Alex?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I wanted to say something about the villages too. It is kind of scary watching it spread out because I remember when I was a little kid, I remember just one day my family and I were driving down the highway and you would see these houses like where'd they come from? It's absolutely insane at the rate this neighborhood is spreading.
Yeah, they build them so fast down there.
Oh, Paula in the chat said, "Do females stay around their nest after it gets empty?"
Kestrels, I assume, correct?
Not sure. She didn't say.
Paula, you're asking, yeah,
Yes.
kestrels. Yep.
They do as long as the young are in the area, but they become less and less conspicuous. And at some point, neither we nor their offspring see them anymore. And so we're talking about if they just have one brood that year, which is the norm. It's very rare to have more than one for kestrels. I would say like it's in early August, the chances of seeing them have diminished greatly, but we don't know how far away they are because we're not tagging adults. We do want to track adult males because we want to see when they're feeding young, because we want to see how big an area they need. And we also want to do some other things at the nest to find out what they're eating, how frequently they're coming in, that sort of thing. So to answer your question with a really long answer that doesn't answer it, not sure. But everybody, I think everybody I've talked with who monitors boxes for data in Florida, they say, despite the fact that it's a resident species, it's a non-migratory species, there comes a time where they're just not around their nest territories. And a good part of the winter, we just don't know how far away they are. We will eventually be learning that, though, from our tag birds.
Ken, I have one quick question as far as the kestrel boxes. I know we have them at the Ocala Recharge Park, and we have people from Marion Audubon who monitor those, so we do that. But like, can anybody put up a kestrel box like you do a bluebird box, or is it a little bit more complicated?
It's a little bit harder. You want to have
Okay.
them above. If you put them in the right habitat, it's gonna burn, preferably within the next 3 years, and it
Okay.
can burn up your box. You want to have them on the Withlacoochee. The folks there are putting them up at about 22 feet.
Okay, so they need to be high.
They need to be high. And what ARCI has been doing elsewhere is we use what are called articulated arms. It's also called a mast chalice on a sailboat, so that you can lower the mast at sea and repair it if it's damaged. So these put a box up at about 14 feet, and the box is attached to the 2x4, the vertical piece, with a Lazy Susan ball bearing arrangement, so that as you lower this arm to horizontal and the box is coming down, the box always maintains a vertical position.
I see. I got you. Yeah, that'd be a little more complicated.
Yeah, it is. And also because it's made out of wood. I love them. They're great. And they're made out of dimensional timber, square corners that are, it makes it harder for flying squirrels to get up to these things. As long as you don't put them too close to a tree. And then you can lower the arm, you can clean the box out. It's a good way when we're tagging nestlings to just bring the whole arm down, take one out at a time, work on it, put it back in its box. Keeps the birds nice and calm. But it's a fire. It's not going to survive in a pyrogenic landscape. Your new word.
Okay. Gotcha.
We're trying to come up with a design. Hey, if any of you think of something, let me know. A design where we can build a fireproof articulating pole, because I'll tell you, there are a lot of state parks and management areas, et cetera, that rely on fire management.
Yes.
Definitely. At some of the state parks that should have kestrels, because they're being burned frequently, but they refuse to let volunteers or folks like us or anybody put boxes in, because they feel obliged to not burn during the growing season when there's going to be kestrels in the box, because they don't want to kill the birds, catch the box on fire, and then bring all kinds of grief on themselves.
Interesting.
So, oh, gosh, I think a fireproof box would be a great management achievement. That's something I'm asking everybody to try to think of a good design.
All right. Well, that sounds, yeah. We'll have to put our thinking caps on.
Please.